When I recently covered the helicopter carrier Moskva, I cracked a bit of a joke at the end of the video, commenting that at least some people probably clicked on it, thinking it was going to talk about a rather more infamous Moskva. Of course it didn't, but I did note I was going to cover that ship eventually. Well, here we are. In today's video, we'll look at the Soviet missile cruiser Slava, which was, upon the collapse of the Soviet Union, renamed. In 1995, Slava would become Moskva, one of a relatively few cases where a named ship ended up with a name change. Of course, as most sailors will tell you, renaming a ship already in service can be a poor omen. Not always, but it's certainly a superstition for a reason. Moskva would defy that superstition for at least a while. She returned to service with the Russian Navy in 2000 and would have a largely uneventful time of things for 2 decades. Moskva saw a brief stint of combat in 2008 during the conflict with Georgia, but that was about it. She spent her time on exercises, training, and refits. A fairly standard story for any peacetime warship, really. This all changed in 2022 with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Moskva, as the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, was involved from the start, notably at Snake Island. However, Slava-class cruisers aren't really built for land attack in the way their American equivalents are. So Moskva was of more use as a floating air defense battery and flagship. Those massive anti-ship missiles didn't exactly have a target to fire upon. Unfortunately for the Russians, that lack of direct combat did not mean Moskva wasn't a target. The ship would be famously sunk in action in April of 2022. What you believe on this topic is going to be directly tied to your view on the war itself. That she was sunk by Ukrainian Neptune missiles or by an internal fire and explosion. We'll get to that towards the end of this video as much as I can. Before then, however, we'll need to look at her time as Slava. After all, the Slava-class were the ultimate expression of Soviet cruiser doctrine in the Cold War, and something that needs to be looked at to understand how Moskva ended up in the position she was in. This story originated in the early 1970s as the Soviets developed a new anti-ship missile. This was the P-500 Basalt, or to use the NATO name, the SSN-12 Sandbox. A fairly chunky missile coming in at 4,800 kilograms, 10,600 pounds, or 5.3 tons, with a range of 550 kilometers. As for the warhead, this came in at 950 kilograms, 2,094 pounds for a conventional load, or a 350 kiloton nuclear warhead as an alternative option. Regardless of the payload, those missiles were still quite large. At first, only the Kiev-class carriers or aviation cruisers could carry them, along with larger missile submarines like the Echo or Juliet class. However, the Soviets were never ones to leave a missile be without stuffing it on as many platforms as humanly possible. For the Basalt, this would necessitate a new cruiser entirely. Something large, if not quite as ludicrous as the Kirovs. Certainly larger than any contemporary Soviet cruiser. Thus, as the Basalt design matured, the Soviets built a new ship around that missile. This would be Project 1164 Atlant. Initial design work began in October 1972. The Soviets desired a ship of around 10,000 tons built around the new Basalt. Design work would continue through to August 21, 1974, as various plans came and went. The core concept remained the same from start to finish. a ship dedicated to firing anti-ship missiles instead of air defense or anti-submarine warfare. This isn't to say that Project 1164 was at all incapable of air defense. In the final design, the ship would carry around 100 surface-to-air missiles. Anti-submarine warfare, on the other hand, was very much a distant third. Her weaponry there is pretty scant by Soviet standards. Regardless, with the design approved in late 1974, construction could begin. The ship that would become Slava was laid down on November 4th, 1976, in what was then known as Nikolaev, but is now Mykolaiv in Ukraine, with the ship launched on July 27, 1979, and commissioned on January 30th, 1983. Quite a lengthy construction process, but then this was a very experimental ship. Let's touch on that real quick before we move to service. As noted before, Slava was designed to displace around 10,000 tons. As it would turn out, the ship displaced around 9,400 tons standard and 11,500 when fully loaded, or alternatively 9,800 tons standard and 11,200 to 12,500 tons full. As is often the case with Soviet ships, sources will never agree on the displacement. Regardless, on that displacement, the Soviets crammed in a lot of weaponry. The biggest, of course, being the Basalt missiles. Slava carried 16 of those in 8 twin launchers, 4 on either side of the ship. They're by far the most distinctive feature of this class. A less visible feature would be the anti-aircraft battery. 8 8-tube launchers carried amidships for the S-300F Fort missile. A total of 64 missiles in all. These are arranged in a circular pattern, which is quite distinctive from above. To support those, the ship also carried 40 OSA-M SAN-4 Gecko missiles and 2 launchers on the stern, along with 1 twin 130mm AK-130 gun and 6 30mm AK-630 Sea Whiz guns, with weaponry rounded off by 2 12-tube RBU 6000 anti-submarine mortars, and 2 quintuple torpedo launchers for 10 tubes in all. Again, very heavily armed for the size, though in keeping with when the ship was developed, she doesn't have any armor, which means speed will round things off for this section, at 32 knots on 130,000 shaft horsepower through 2 shafts. Now we can return to the service history. As noted, this ship was commissioned at the start of 1983. That meant she had less than a decade of active service under the Soviet flag, though, as is common with Soviet ships, details on that service are sparse. For instance, Naval Encyclopedia states that she made her long shakedown cruise at the end of 1986, which would leave a blank area of 3 years. I've only found one source in Russian that gives more info. In September 1983, she would move to the Northern Fleet to test her missiles. Then a year later, in September 1984, the ship moved back to the Black Sea, with Slava earning a pennant for courage and military valor in December 1985, with the ship going into the Mediterranean in January and February 1986, with a visit to Greece coming at the end of the year from November 18th to the 22nd. After this, the cruiser likely spent her time on typical Soviet duty. To use her later namesake Moskva as an example, patrol and training, likely in the Mediterranean for the most part, with the next notable events coming in 1989. First, a joint Soviet-American experiment on remote detection of nuclear missiles, with this coming in July 1989. Then she was part of the Malta Summit, a meeting on December 2nd and 3rd between Mikhail Gorbachev and George H.W. Bush. Among other things, this saw the official declaration of an end to the Cold War. Your mileage may vary on how accurate that was, though to be fair, 1990 and 1991 were a time of collapse in the Soviet Union. On that note, it was also when Slava, still relatively new, went in for a refit that lasted as long as her service to that point. In December 1990, she was moored in Mykolaiv for an overhaul. This would end up lasting through to 1998. Interestingly, some websites, older ones naturally, cite a skepticism that the ship would return to service. She did, of course, but it's an interesting artifact of the times. Regardless, the ship was renamed Moskva on May 15, 1995, while still under refit. One of the aforementioned older websites cites a reason why, that the ship was adopted by Moscow, with the city paying the costs of the overhaul. Moskva would only return to service formally in April of 2000. At this point, she took up her long-term role as flagship of the Black Sea Fleet. Her service in this role would largely match that of Soviet ships, port visits and long-term voyages to foreign countries. For instance, in August 2001, when she visited France, Italy, and Tunisia, or in 2002, when she visited France and Syria, with the long-term voyage coming in 2003. This came in April when Moskva and a couple other Russian ships went on exercises in the Indian Ocean, with units of the Pacific Fleet, along with the Indian Navy for that matter. In any event, this pattern would continue for the rest of the early 2000s, from Malta, where the ship brought the ensemble of the Black Sea Fleet for a concert in 2004, to various other ports into 2008 and 2009. That said, 2008 would see a break. This saw the Russian invasion of Georgia. Exactly how involved Moskva was varies between sources. A contemporary Wired article cites the ship being hit by a Georgian missile before the Georgian fleet, such as it was destroyed. If true, that's an ominous sign of things to come. I do need to emphasize, if true, of course. After this, however, it was back to the peacetime routine. This would last through to 2015, though the ship did have a couple noteworthy voyages. For instance, she would visit Cuba in August 2013. And in 2014, unsurprisingly, Moskva acted in support of the Russian seizure of Crimea. She would then, in 2015, operate off Syria during the Russian air campaign in that civil war, including sailing near Turkey after the shooting down of an Su-24 near the Turkish border. The rest of the 2010s into the early 2020s would be far quieter. Periods of refit and training, with the ship largely sticking closer to home. At some point, she also swapped her Basalt missiles for the newer P-1000 Vulcan, likely in 2020, with sources citing the first test firing in 2021. If so, well, Moskva wouldn't have those missiles for very long. In February 2022, she supported Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This would famously see Moskva lead the seizure of Snake Island on February 24, 2022. The famous last transmission from the island has become a bit of a rallying cry for Ukraine. I would say it, but at the same time, I'd rather not risk poking the YouTube bear over language concerns. it's pretty well penetrated the common discussion about the war. Regardless, during her active wartime service, Moskva operated more as a mobile air defense platform. Her fancy new Vulcans were useless for ground attack, so the ship instead put her S-300s to use, at least in theory. In practice, Moskva's role was short. On April 13, 2022, the ship was on fire, and on April 14th, she was on the bottom. This is the part where things get very, very, very partisan. Most sources at this point will agree that the ship was sunk by Ukraine, specifically by the new Neptune anti-ship missiles. Russia, and by extension pro-Russia internet types, will argue differently, that there was a fire aboard that caused a secondary explosion, with Moskva sinking under tow. That said, Dmitry Skripets, the father of one of the missing sailors, put together a sequence of events, apparently using mostly publicly available material, including reports from survivors. This all paints a very bleak picture of Moskva's combat readiness. Of course, this is in Russian. I'll still link the dossier itself in the description if you happen to speak the language, as well as various sources going over the material. But for the short version, the ship was riddled with technical issues and operating with a less than ideal crew. According to Skripets, 100 experienced sailors were taken off right before the war and replaced by 83 conscripts. Moskva was ordered to not go within 30 kilometers of Ukraine's coast, but often did so anyway, even with issues with the radar. For example, on March 7th, a possible UAV got within 7 kilometers before being detected. Another source on the dossier cites Moskva being in terrible shape, and much of the equipment still being Soviet-era gear. One of the AK-630 cannons was defective, the AK-130 had hydraulic issues, and the missiles were malfunctioning. In addition, 4 of the turbines were beyond their intended service life, and the steering gear, boilers, and cooling pumps were in need of maintenance. Despite all of this, Moskva was sent to guard the Odessa gas field. She did this alone with no escort, and well within range of the Neptune missiles, which Russia would have to be blind to not be aware of. Unless they had dismissed the missiles as propaganda pieces, which is, I suppose, within the realm of possibility. In any event, Moskva would be hit by 2 missiles on April 13th, about 3 to 4 meters above the waterline. The diagram on screen shows where. The first one hit the central part of the cruiser, right by the galley and the mess rooms. More critically, it wrecked the damaged control post and engine room, while the second missile hit below one of the AK-630 guns. Inside, the ship's hull cracked and buckled. Making matters worse, fire spread throughout the cruiser. The crew tried to fight the fires, but it wasn't enough. Most of the surviving crew was taken off, while Moskva was taken under tow by the frigate Admiral Essen. However, by 10 p.m., the fires began to detonate ammunition. As a result, Moskva was abandoned around 11 p.m. on April 13th, with Moskva rolling over and capsizing on April 14th, 2022. Skripets theorizes there was a crack below the waterline. Exactly how many were lost from the crew is another point of contention. It could be a couple dozen, it could be more. The general secrecy makes it hard to be sure. Regardless, Moskva's sinking is a very hefty black mark on the Russian Navy. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.